Well, I'm so excited to have everybody here tonight. I welcome you, and we're in for a real treat. I guarantee you. I just have a couple of announcements before we begin, and then we'll turn it over to Colonel Paul Lockhart. So, I don't see her tonight, but she was going to be here, Angela Harris. So Angela was the one who was going to do our quarterly workshop in February, and I hope you'll all come. I gave the handout for her. It's going to be in May, and she was so gracious to go ahead and have her event canceled so that we could have the Colonel here tonight. And so that's one announcement, that we have the next quarterly workshop will be in May. Also, you should have all received your letter. I unfortunately met with somebody this afternoon who did not get the letter, the annual letter. So if you did not get your annual letter, please see one of us. Hopefully you recognize us. We're running all over the place. And so make sure you get your annual letter on the changes that took place in the law. So, other than that, we're going to go ahead and get into it. Oh, I did want to introduce my two sons. I know that you really haven't seen my family very much. This is not my son, but he's lined up here with them. But this is Nathan, and then Jacob. And with Jacob, I actually wanted to let you know that he is the reason why we were able to get the Colonel here tonight, along with a man named Jim Smith, who's been so gracious in working with my wife. You know, you can't buy this. This is out of the goodness of their heart and their patriotism, and so I'm so grateful for that. So Jacob was so excited, he wanted to do a little bit of the introduction with me, so come on over here, Jacob, and so we're going to share this. Go ahead and do your part, and then I'll kind of be the cleanup man.
Okay, so Paul Lockhart served 2 missions, proud of both of them. He calls his channel his own. Yeah, he saved on 1/10 seconds of a second of his life. Yep.
Colonel Lockhart has spent 25 years in the Air Force, and I know he's going to share with us many of his accomplishments, but I'll just highlight a few. One thing that he mentioned to me that I thought was revealing is that he began his career as an astronaut as a young boy. And that is a little glimpse into the inside of this man. He did, as my son said, command 2 space shuttle missions, and he spent approximately, I believe it was 29 days, although I'm finding conflicting. Yeah, I think that's it, but it is 29 days. Yes, in space, so that's like a really long extended, the only thing I could relate it to was like a really long camp out in outer space, okay? So that is amazing. He actually has he comes to Las Vegas a couple of times a year, and he has spent some of his time at Nellis Air Force Base.
I have.
Okay, excellent. And oh, by the way, I tried to put this lavalier microphone on him, and it had nothing to do with it. He's got this great booming voice, so so that's wonderful. You know, there are other wonderful things, but I just wanted to mention that the reason why I believe, in my short interactions that I've had with the Colonel, as to why he's an American hero, it's not just the fact that he represented us in outer space and our wonderful space program, but every time I've seen him interacting, and you don't know this, but I was there this afternoon when he spoke to some of the school children, and he is just so like in the space of the children, and inspiring them and letting them know that, you know, he is approachable, and I don't know, I guess for me that's just such a nice touch. And so I want to have us all welcome the American hero, astronaut Colonel Paul Lockhart.
Thank you very much. I'd like to make sure I know what time or how long we have so that I can do this appropriately, or do we've got 30 minutes or an hour?
An hour would be great.
An hour would be great, right? Sounds good. It's a Friday evening. We're all here. It's beautiful outside. Thank you so much for having me here. There's 12 to 15 inches of snow back in Virginia. I am very glad to be here. I have to go back tomorrow, but at least for right now, I'm with you all. And as you know, it has been noted, I've spent some time out here before, out at Nellis Air Force Base, so it's always a pleasure to come back. I haven't been in the military like many of you are, have been associated with. You know, you travel all around, and so I was stationed in California and, you know, flew out of here a little bit. So, were I to take a random sample, I can guarantee you that anybody I pick would have somebody that's connected back to NASA somehow. Either a cousin or an uncle, or they have a friend that's worked for NASA or a neighbor. In fact, I'll bet you there's a gentleman over there in the red shirt who's raising his left hand, who has a son who works at Johnson Space Center right now in a program that I'm very familiar with. So I like to talk about, you know, the program that I was associated with in the space shuttle, but I want everybody to recognize this is our nation's space program, right? And we're very fortunate to have been part of it. And it began, you know, many years when I was a little fellow, but what's important to me, at least in my mind, is that I'm just a small part of this very important, I think, endeavor for America and for our young children. And it's going to become even more important, and it's incumbent upon us to continue to let the young people in our futures know how space will be an important part of what they do. So how do I talk to a big audience such as this? I mean, it's grand. There are people here that are probably more knowledgeable of aviation than I am, and yet I have some little ones right here that are interested in the fun in space and stuff. So I'll kind of try and go back and forth to make this as interesting as possible. So let's do it in two parts. Let's talk past and let's talk future. So let's talk about past, which was my part of the space program, which was the shuttle program, and then the future, which is going to be what NASA's going to do next, so that you have a good understanding of where we're going. So the space shuttle. Where did the space shuttle fit? Well, if we know our space program, we started out in the early 1960s with a program under President Kennedy to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade and return him safely, right? Well, we started out with the Mercury program. Let's put one person into space. Then we went to the Gemini program. Gemini means two. Let's put two people into orbit, and let's start developing the skills to fly a spacecraft in orbit and to rendezvous and things of this nature. Then from the Gemini, we went to the Apollo program, as we remember. And the Apollo program was, let's get to the moon and back, which you know we safely did. And the more I am in the space program or around aviation, I realize what a remarkable event that was. So you two stick with me. We're going to see some space stuff here in just a second, okay? So then after the Apollo program ended, NASA was, well, what do we do now? And so they had kind of a bridge program called Skylab, if you recall, which was, well, let's work with the Russians and let's have a space station in orbit to do some preliminary science. But the next thing we're going to build is the space shuttle. And the space shuttle, when you think about it, is a remarkable vehicle because it was intended to be a reusable spacecraft. In fact, it was intended to be, first of all, a rocket to go into space. Once you got into space, it would turn into an orbiting laboratory. And then once you were finished doing your work in space, it turned into a re-entry vehicle. Then it turned into a hypersonic vehicle, which means very fast speeds. And then it turned into basically an unpowered glider to land. So it had many roles to play. And NASA really moved out on the cutting edge with the space shuttle program, right? So we went right from rockets, the Apollo program, to the space shuttle. A spacecraft that has wings and a tail and is reusable, that was a big leap that NASA took. And we found in the space shuttle program that we really went really far. The space shuttle never became quite the operational vehicle that we wanted it to be, but it did provide us the capability to go in space and learn about how to live in space and to start building the International Space Station, which is why I was brought to NASA in the mid-1990s to become an astronaut. We were really starting to build up the space shuttle at the time. And the reason why the space shuttle was so good is because it had a huge cargo bay, and you'll see this here in just a little bit. So if I open it up and the kids can see, it's hard to see back there, but just realize a big cargo bay, and you could get big pieces in there. But the space shuttle never went outside of what is called LEO, low Earth orbit. And I'm sure many of you know that, but think about that. Here we had just gone to the moon in 1969, and then 1972 was Apollo 17, and then we stopped. And with the space shuttle program, we were stuck in low Earth orbit. But it was a magnificent vehicle. But we saw immediately with the loss of the Columbia space shuttle in 2003 that it had a limited use, and so they decided to go ahead and close on that program, and that then would lead us into the future of what I want to talk about next. So let's talk about where I fit in here, which was NASA said, hey, we need astronauts in 1996. We're going to pull in the biggest group of astronauts ever, and we're going to start building the space station. And we're going to use the space shuttle with a big payload bay. We're going to carry the pieces up, and we're going to build this structure in space where astronauts are going to live, perform work, perform science, and actually develop the skill sets that are going to allow you to go to Moon and Mars in the future. And so that's what we did. So bear with me now. I'll try and weave in some stuff for the young folks right here. So how do we get those pieces of structure up into space? We use the space shuttle. And I hope you all will bear with me once again. I know some of you are probably as familiar with this as I am. But of course, here is the model of the space shuttle. I'll go ahead and pull this off for just a second. But I'm going to show this because we'll then show the launch. All right, so the space shuttle sits on the stack. So I don't recall if you two were at my meeting this morning, or if you were, but remember, I have to get the space shuttle in orbit. And physics says that I have to be traveling 18,000 miles an hour for me to stay in orbit. If I don't reach 18,000 miles an hour, then the Earth says, through its gravity, I'm going to pull you back, and you're going to return into the Earth's atmosphere somewhere inland. So how do I become 18,000 miles an hour faster than I am when I launch? Well, for the space shuttle, we use the solid rocket boosters, which are the two white rockets on the side, and mark those because we'll talk about them later. And then we use this big liquid oxygen tank and liquid hydrogen tank. So this is the fuel tank right through here. They're going to power the three main engines which are on the bottom of the space shuttle. And you'll see that right through here when we do our launch in just a second. So what is the sequence? What makes us go from launch to on orbit in 8.5 minutes? We go out to the pad 4.5 hours prior to launch. We practice this, and as we go out in the silver van, that's the first time you get this very unique feeling that today is different. Because as you're traveling out towards the pad, every other car is going this way. So you go out to the pad, and usually the pad is got lots of people there. There's all kinds of technicians. Well, on the day of launch, it's quiet. It's just you, your crew, and a few closeout personnel. You go up the elevator, up to the level where the crew hatch is, and again, there's just a few people that are helping you go in. You climb into the space shuttle, you get down into your seats, they take the commander first and then the pilot, and you lie on your seats, and you have to remember now the space shuttle is on its back. So it's as if all of us right now tilted our seats back and we were laying on our backs. So 4 hours prior to that, we go in, we lie down, and it takes about 4 hours to go through the process of getting strapped in, going through your communications checks, checking the space shuttle, making sure that everything is going well, and almost invariably, you sit here and say, I'm not going to go today because something will happen, weather or a leak will occur or whatever the case. And you sit there and you think, I don't want that to happen because I have 600 friends that came just to watch me launch. But bar none, on both of my flights, I was delayed 2 weeks on each one. There was just those things that happened, right? But on the day that you go, it almost catches you by surprise because everything clicks down and goes right. But it's almost quiet, and as you get down closer to the launch, you don't know that it's really going to occur because you get these hold periods and you're just listening to the chatter back and forth with the ground control until 6 minutes prior. At 6 minutes prior is when the pilot gets busy. He has to take the space shuttle and turn it alive. which means I start turning on all of the machines in it, the auxiliary power units, and I start waking up the space shuttle so that it can do its own work. And if you don't get it done at the right time, then the computer systems say, uh-oh, something's not right, and it shuts down. So that's the very first time that the pilot's, he is on stage, and he doesn't want to do anything wrong. So you practice that, guaranteed, 6 minutes APU. I can throw 25 switches really fast and get it done in the time I'm supposed to. And then you go, okay, I'm done, I'm the pilot, I can relax. And then the next thing you know, it's 2 minutes prior, the launch control director is calling up to the commander and saying, you know, Endeavor, this is launch control, 2 minutes to launch, close your visors, oxygen 100%, good luck. And you go, hey, it's really happening this time. And you think, this is kind of interesting, I wasn't expecting it. And so you get back down in your seat, and then you watch the clock, and you just can't really imagine how fast it's clicking down, and you go, well, there's not much I can do anyway, let's go for the ride. And so as you count down, at 30 seconds something occurs, 20 seconds, 10 seconds, of course, before launch, you hear the countdown sequence, and at 6 seconds, that's when the first thing occurs that you notice. That's when you start the main engines. And the reason why you start the main engines is because, thank you much, sir, is because you want to make sure that these main engines work before I ignite the solid rocket boosters, because the solid rocket boosters I can't turn off. So once they light, you're gone. So you make sure that the main engines work properly, and when the main engines work properly, they come on full power and they push the space shuttle a little bit out of position. And it's called a twang. So the space shuttle moves a little bit because it's off center, and then it comes back to the position, and right at that time is when they light the solid rocket boosters. And when that occurs, that is the ride that everybody thinks about what's going to happen. And for us in the crew, you can actually feel the shake. You can feel the main engine below, the solid rocket boosters. Of course, it's a very big shake that vibrates up in the bottom of the whole stack, as we call it, excuse me, sir. And it vibrates up, but you know what? You don't pay attention to it. Everything's happening inside the cockpit, but your training commits almost automatically. As the pilot, my job is the engines. Check the engines, check the attitude indicator, make sure that's right. Look over at the auxiliary power units, making sure they're rated at 3 at 100%. Check the electrical systems, make sure that's good. Come on back down the orbital maneuvering system, make sure that's good. The commander is making the calls. He's checking our altitude, our bank angle, our pitch angle, the computers. Everything is clicking like clockwork in there. And you start getting into the pacing. We're at 1,000 feet. We're 10 seconds into launch. And it happens about like that until 2.5 minutes when the solid rocket boosters are done. And when the boosters are done, they're not needed anymore. So we get rid of them. We jettison them. And I hope everybody can still hear me in the back, right? Okay, good. So I jettison the solid rocket boosters, and now the ride goes from being very rough on those solid rocket boosters to very smooth. And you continue then for another 6.5 minutes till you get in orbit. And many ask me, when is the first time you really thought about being in space that you really noticed something? It was on ascent after thank you very much, the solid rocket boosters are gone, and I'm just riding up on the external tank, and I'll take this one now, thank you. So I'm riding up on the external tank, and the space shuttle is belly up, and I have to rotate in order to get communications with our TDRS satellite up there. And as the space shuttle rotated, I took a moment to look from inside the cockpit to outside this window, which is in the upper right, out my pilot's window. And what I saw was black, 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 and then all of a sudden this big blue orb moved into view. And it just kind of rolled in to position and stopped. And it was one of those moments when I went, wow, I'm really in space. Look at that beautiful blue ocean, the Atlantic Ocean below us. And that was about 10 seconds, and then my head had to come back inside and go through the entire launch sequence. And it takes 8.5 minutes. And it's a very, it's an event that we can practice, we're used to it, we know what happens. And at the end of it, main engine cut off, we're thrown into our straps. You know you're weightless because everything starts to float there. And we'll now do a video for the launch, and then we'll carry into the rest of it. I think you'll like the rest of it. And this will be very useful for for the little ones. Okay, are you ready? So what happens in 6 seconds? The main engines, right? Right? Okay, so here's my vehicle. Let's get some sound. If we can.
30 seconds to count.
So there's the countdown. 26 seconds here.
Arming chain is on.
There's the solid rockets. There's the
Sounds like pressure water
tank.
system activated.
I'm sitting right here. Here are the 3 main engines. We're down now to about 10.
T minus 10, 9, 8, 7.
Watch the main engines come to full power. You can feel this inside. Whole stack. 3, 2, 1. Lift off. And I always take young kids at this time and I shake them in their seats because that's exactly what happens. It's a very rough ride at first because the solids are not a smooth thrusting mechanism. So for those of us that are older, where's my family? They're 3 miles away on a building watching all of this, and so they get the closest view. And at night, the whole thing lights up, so it almost becomes day. And around the family are astronaut escorts that are there to take care of them in case something happens. But this is the most dynamic part of the launch right here. And so it almost becomes like the sun is coming up. We're going through this entire pacing that I'm talking about. Right now we're probably about 80,000 feet, probably doing about 1,000 miles an hour. We're banking over, we're turning. The whole idea is to get through the Earth's atmosphere as fast as you can, bank over, and then pick up speed. Speed is what you need. So here it is. This is the solid rocket boosters, as you can see. There they are. There's the 3 main engines. And there's all of the thrust. So we're probably now about 1 minute and 45 into launch. We're coming up on a Mach 4.5, Mach 4.7, Mach 4.8, Mach 4.9, 5.0, 5.1, somewhere around now, Mach 5.3, boom. You get rid of the solid rocket boosters, and now the ride is quiet. But you know, the most dangerous part of ascent's over, but you're not in space yet. If I was to lose an engine now, I wouldn't make it across the ocean. So I still have to ride on, thank you very much, Jim, I still have to ride on the main engines to get me into space. But the faster I go, the closer I get to the finish of the 8.5 minutes, the more options I have in case I lose an engine or if I lose 2 engines. And we just go through a countdown where it's abort to orbit, or TAL is reached, that's transoceanic abort landing. So we now have enough thrust. And eventually I reach altitude, I reach the targets, I reach main engine cutoff, we shut those off, and as I said, we're thrown into our straps, we're now floating, and the work begins because we have to jettison the external tank. You all remember now that the solid rocket boosters are gone, right? And here's something that most people don't realize. We always target to be a little bit slower than we need to be to stay in orbit. So if our speed in orbit needs to be 25,500 feet per second, we'll target 25,200 feet per second. The reason why is we jettison the external tank. And we want the external tank to not have enough speed to stay in orbit. We want Earth's gravity to pull it in, right? So it's going to fall back into Earth's atmosphere, break up into pieces, and fall into the Indian Ocean. And as soon as we separate, we are now moving this direction. We'll burn the orbital maneuvering system engines, pick up about 200 feet per second. That's not much. It's about a 2-minute burn. Thrust a little bit, whoosh, you can feel that. And then I'll pick up speed, and wham. Next thing you know, now I have the right orbital speed. So the physics that was developed way back by Kepler in the 1400s fits perfectly. So this is the big physics I always tell the kids. This is why the science and math is so important. Right? If I miss that speed by 200 feet per second, if I can't reach it, then I'm going to be visiting Spain or Morocco. Right? Which isn't too bad, but I always wanted to go in orbit. I want to make sure I make it there, right? So what happens then? All right, what happens next is I'm going on a picnic now. I've made it into orbit. I have to get the space shuttle ready to do work. It's as if I took a big station wagon and we're gone camping and we've reached the mountains and we've reached our picnic grounds. I now have to pull stuff out and get stuff ready to do all of our work. So immediately everybody starts into their different jobs in order to make the space shuttle a laboratory in space. for the not the rookies, but the ones, the veterans that are in space, they know how to move. They know how not to move your head around too fast. For the rookies, it's a time when your body and your stomach say, I really don't think you should be here at this time. And so you learn to move as best you can without moving your head. But there's things to do, such as, you know, put away our spacesuits. For the commander and the pilot, there's the things that say, turn it from a launch rocket, as I said, into an orbiting laboratory. So I have things to do with the computer. So it takes about an hour and a half to get that all done. We've now tidied up, and the first thing we do is go to bed. And the reason why is we've been up all day. That's kind of like the culmination of the event. We're now finished. Let's go to sleep. And for those that are first time in orbit, they find that it's you know, the body is adapting to it. You grow about an inch in space, and so your back hurts. And so for the first time you're there, you don't know how to stretch that out so that you can sleep well. You know, you generally have to curl up to stretch the muscles. So you do a fitful sleep usually the first night. And it's really important because on day 2, we have to go catch up with the space station. So day 1 launch. Day 2 is, let's go rendezvous with the space station. And that's about a day and a half affair to catch up around the Earth, because we launch with enough room in between, of course, to make things safe. And then we fly the space shuttle in a series of catch-up maneuvers so that we can go right underneath the space station and then dock. And of course, when you dock, you bring the 2 pieces of the space structure, the space shuttle and the space station together very slowly at 0.1 feet per second. As my wife said when she watched it, I got very bored. It's like watching paint dry. Because it happens very slow. But you can understand why. Both of you are traveling 18,000 miles an hour, and the target you can't miss, and if you can't dock, you can't do your mission. So we come together, we dock, and you'll see that in just a minute. And then the first thing to do is basically, it's like picnic day number 2. It's time to start transferring supplies from the space shuttle to the space station and get set up for the work you're going to do there. And now you're on about flight day 2.5. So it's about 2.5 days after launch. You've done everything in terms of docking, moving stuff out, and getting ready. So let's go do this one if we can. Beautiful world, if you would please. Perfectly. Let me make sure. Whole new world, I'm sorry. Whole new world. All right, so here we go. So this is the docking with the space station. There it is. This is when it wasn't quite as big as it was then. I'm looking at the space station from the space shuttle, and if there's a little bit of sound there, right there is my target. That little cross is what I'm aiming for. And if I miss that cross by 3 inches, the 2 pieces will bounce off. And so it's almost like a concerted effort, very much of a team effort between the 2 of us that are flying the space shuttle and the rest of the crew. And here we are targeting, we're bringing these 2 things together. There's my target, I make one last correction, and now the 2 pieces come together. So now, I have a maiden space shuttle with the space station. Pretty neat, huh? I think that's pretty cool. And then about 2 hours later, we open up the hatch between us and the folks on the space station, and that is not pretend. Those people are really happy to see us. I mean, they are very happy to see us because we bring them things like fresh food, right? And so immediately, soon after, here we are, we start in the laboratory and we start bringing supplies over. How would you like to clean your room like that someday? Just floating along? So we bring over all of the equipment that we need. This is one of our Russians that were flying at the time. This is Valery Korzun, a Russian. If you'll ask me about Valery afterwards, I have an interesting story there. So here we are getting ready for spacewalks, right through here. Peggy Whitson, who I took up on my first flight and brought home 6 months later on my second, is bringing over an experiment that she was doing on the space shuttle and bringing it back to the space station to bring home. We're going to now take a little tour from the space shuttle to the space station. So I'm going to fly, basically, I'm going to float down from the flight deck to the mid deck. I'm going to go through this hatch. I'm going now into the node between the space shuttle and the space station. I'm going now into the laboratory of the space station. And it looks like a laboratory. There are quite a few things there. And so I'm going to float over Ken Bauer's socks. Look to the left, you're going to see the airlock where we do the spacewalks. So there they are. There's a speed sign there right there that says careful speeding 18,000 miles an hour. So we're going through the various parts of the space station right now. This is on the Russian side, and so these are storage lockers. We're going into one of the nodes. These are the connecting pieces right here on the Russian side. And now we're going into basically the command post for the Russian side of the space station. And it is very different from the American side. Their approach to things is very different. Very good, very simple. I liked their food. It was good. Here we are sleeping. For the young folks here, this is really neat because here's Peggy sleeping and she likes to be all tied up, and here I am, I'm sleeping on the ceiling right through here. And so here I am getting ready. One morning, here's our little area on the flight, on the mid-deck where we can get cleaned up. I do this for the young kids to see how quickly you can get ready to go in the morning time. Right? Now, here's the thing that you probably don't realize. Look how I have to have everything Velcroed down. It is really hard to just do little things in space because you have to keep track of everything. This was a little breakfast taco that we're making here, and we just bite off into that. You know, we had planned periods for our breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You know, they'd give us 40 minutes for this and 20 minutes for that, but I didn't spend much time. No one else did. You had so much to do that you would grab your food and go. And this is me flying the space shuttle as we were basically docking right through there. And that's the end of the docking. Okay, so we've now docked. I've taken you on a tour. We moved all of the equipment over, but now the hard work becomes evident. Now it's time to build the space station. Remember all of those pieces that we brought up? It's time to do the spacewalks. So, do the commanders and the pilots do the spacewalks? No, because they want us to stay inside because we have to fly the space shuttle home. If something were to happen, there's no one to get it back. That being said, we're very important to what happens. Either as the commander, you oversee the entire operation to make it safe, or in my case, I was what is called the IV, the intravehicular astronaut, to support the two extravehicular astronauts, which are the ones that did the spacewalks. So, if you recall on the launch, we have orange flight suits. Those are our launch and entry suits for ascent and entry. The spacewalks are done in white spacesuits. They're totally different. These are capable of keeping you in space, provided with air, pressure, water, up to about 7 hours. But it takes about 3.5 to get into your suit, go through all of the process, and then after you do your spacewalk, it takes about another 3.5 to come back in. And that's because you have to go through the crew hatch, you have to depressurize the hatch, you have to exit, and then when you come back in, you have to repressurize the hatch at the right protocol, and then you enter into the space station afterwards, and then you have to unsuit everybody, and all of that takes a lot of period of time. You don't want anybody to get hurt. So as you can imagine, those guys are in those spacesuits at a pressurization of 4.3 pounds per square inch, and that's not what's in here. We're 14.7 here, but they're 4.3. But still, that means that the gloves that they're wearing are pressurized at 4.3 in space, which means that they're stiff, which means if they want to close their hands around a tool, they have to bend and hold the tool. So it's not as if it's reflexive. You have to bend and hold. They have these big helmets on. They have their pressure suit on. They have heaters. They have visors, they have lights, and so the whole process of working in space is really hard. Realize, we go around the Earth every 90 minutes, so we go from sunlight to sunrise to dark to night every 45 minutes. And so the temperatures get very hot when the sun is directly on you, then as soon as you go in the dark, and there is no twilight, it's either light or dark. And as soon as you go into dark, the temperatures plummet, and so they get very cold. So somebody has to tell them, hey, we're about to enter into night, turn your heaters, your glove heaters on, get your visor up that's protecting you, that has the dark, like sunglasses, and get ready now to do the next piece of work. And so the intervehicular person is kind of like the conductor of an orchestra. He's the one that's telling them, go pick up this piece, go do this, watch out, don't kick that antenna, because they can't see. But when it's done right, in those 7 hours, you can do so much work. And that's how we built the space, the space station, which is a magnificent structure in space. And for the big pieces, we had to use the robotic arm to pull them out of the payload bay and move them around. So we're going to look at spacewalks. Before you hit it, the first thing you'll see is an astronaut on a bicycle, and he has an oxygen mask on. He's breathing pure oxygen. The reason why is we're trying to deplete his nitrogen that's in his bloodstream, because if he did not, at the 4.3 psi, he could suffer the same things that you would suffer if you went scuba diving and came up too quick, what's called the bends. So we have to deplete the nitrogen, get that out, and that's all part of the protocol to get in the suit each day. Remember how I said it took a long time. Okay, so let's do a quick little spacewalk. All right. So there he is, 100%. We're now putting the suit on. Just a little bit of music, please. There you go. So I'm helping put, the whole spacesuit on right through here. And of course, you have to double check and make sure that everything is done right. Here are the two astronauts right here getting their suits on. Here's another person doing part of the checks. And here we're putting them into the airlock. Okay, do you see the feet there? There's one astronaut, there's another astronaut in this small airlock. So we close them up in there, and then we go through a very slow process to depressurize. And once it's depressurized, they push the covers open and they exit out. This is Philippe Perrin, who is our French test pilot that flew with us. And by the way, he did not like his French coffee when he got on orbit, so I got to drink his French coffee. It didn't taste good, the taste buds changed. And here they are working. This is a view from one of the camera helmets. Look at the blue of the Earth here. And it's really hard to see because there's still lights on in here, but for the young people, I show that blue of the Earth, and that's exactly what it looks like up there. It's a magnificent view. So as you can see, they've got the gloves, they're trying to work, and this is kind of hard to see. This is us using a robotic arm. There's the blue of the Earth again. There's one astronaut working here. There's another one working here. And I know which one's the senior astronaut because the senior astronaut has a red stripe around his thigh. Look at the astronaut holding this piece of a robotic arm. That weighs 400 pounds. But he's holding it there, of course, because it's, in effect, weightless, but you still have to do things correctly. And everything is tethered in space twice. You never allow anything to happen that doesn't have two tethers on it. And it was my job to make sure that they didn't untether before they moved from one spot to another, that they weren't tethered in another way. And I'm sorry, I hope I'm not blocking you here. So here they are crawling back into the hatch. Notice right here, this is the senior astronaut. This is me conducting from inside. And I could always tell the rookie astronauts in space from the veterans because the rookies use their legs too much. The legs are really not useful when you're out in space working. And so they learn to keep, the veterans learn to keep their legs nice and still, and they move around just using their arms, holding on to the various handrails on the space station. So here's one of the astronauts coming back in after being in that suit for about 11 hours. You can see how he's pushing his hands out? And that's because he's so stiff. And this is the other one. This is John Harrington. This is our first Native American in space that I got to fly with. John Harrington. He's half Choctaw Indian. And he had a whole group of his nation come and see our launch. Okay. So now, the way I like to think of it is we've now done 3 spacewalks. And each spacewalk takes an entire day. Then we take a break. And during that break, we do all of the little things to take care of the space shuttle. Wastewater, any sort of venting of anything we need to do. Check the IMUs, check the computer updates, check the orbital maneuvering system if we have to make any adjustments to our orbit. So on those off days, we do station keeping and we take care of the space shuttle. Then it's back into another spacewalk and it takes an entire day. And then we come off of that and we do another day where we take care of the space shuttle or the space station to make sure everything is good. So over the course of probably about 7 to 8 days, we get our 3 spacewalks done. And if you have to, then that leaves time to do an extra one if you have to do a 4th one if you didn't get everything done on the 1st. So picture this, you have about 2.5, 3 days to do the rendezvous and docking, about 7 to 8 days to do the 3 spacewalks. So we're now at about 11 days or so, 8 plus 3. And so you can imagine then the rest of that then is the undock of the space shuttle from the space station. I fly around it to take a historical picture of it and just make sure that everything looks right. And that was the pilot's responsibility, is to fly around the space shuttle and take all of these camera pictures. And then there's the flyaway, and then there's a day to prepare to come home. And each of those days has their own little unique things to it. And this leads perfectly into a whole new world. So our job each day was to also take pictures of the Earth. And many folks ask me, well, what do the stars look like in space? Or what does the moon look like? Or what does the sun and things of this nature? Well, stars all look the same. We're really no closer to the stars, so they just don't twinkle. The moon is a little clearer, right? Because it's not through the Earth's atmosphere. The sun is a little bit more fierce, actually, because it too is not being diluted by the atmosphere. And so when you rendezvous and the sun would come up over the horizon, it made it really hard to rendezvous. The one thing that grabbed your attention time and time again was the Earth, right? It's just such a beautiful place that the colors immediately attract your attention. So if we were supposed to take pictures each day, but we did the spacewalks, and then on the days we didn't do the spacewalks, we had to do things such as take care of the shuttle. When did we get our pictures done? Well, they would normally happen about the time that we go to bed, right? When you had a few quiet moments. But for the pilot and the commander, most of the time, we had too many things to do, so it didn't happen too much at that time period. But when we undocked, did the fly around, and got ready to come home, on both of my flights we had a weather delay. Meaning I had about an extra 2 days. And we were ready to come home, and the whole space shuttle at that time was packed up to ready to go home. It's as if you were coming home from your picnic, and you put everything back in your station wagon, and somebody says, okay, we can't leave yet. So what do? We didn't unpack. We took out the cameras, and we took every picture we could. That's when we used all of our our camera film. At that time, there was a camera film, and we were starting to take digitals at that time. So we took all of the pictures of things we did, and that's what I want to show you now. We'll go to A Beautiful World, and that's also when we had some time to do a little play, a little fun in space, which the young folks will like. So let's look at A Beautiful World real quick. Let me explain what we're going to see. You're going to see various pictures, all of which are available on NASA websites. Anybody can go look at any of the pictures that we take. They're all open to public. They're all numbered. And, I think some of the most remarkable pictures come from space because we provide a historical legacy of many parts of the Earth. Right? We've flown over these pieces of terrain since the 1960s, and we keep taking the same picture, and you can see the transformation either from just natural changes or human activity. So the first thing you'll see is opening of the payload bay doors, and then we'll start in, you're going to see things such as the coral reefs around Australia. There will be the desert sands of North Africa. Mount Everest will be here. And because it's on here shortly, I want to tell you that there is going to be a picture of a lake in Canada. It's a round lake, but if you look at it, you can tell that this lake was formed by a meteor millions of years ago. It's just a perfect circle, but no one knew that until you got up in space and looked down. and you could say, oh, it's quite obvious. This is where a meteor struck Earth millions of years ago and created this giant indentation, and now nature has grown up around it with its trees. All right, Jim. A little bit of sound. So there's the payload bay doors opening. Those are the coral reefs off of Australia that I was referring to. There's that lake. See that perfect circular lake there? Those are the red deserts over Africa. There's Mount Everest right there, seen from space. And this is that same lake. You can't see it down here, but it's down here, and these are the northern lights. We flew over the northern lights. So this is, again, a view coming out of the airlock. Look at this blue of the Earth. I always show this to the young people right here. That thin layer is our Earth's atmosphere. And as I explained, that's what keeps us alive, of course, that thin layer of atmosphere. And once again, you have a sunrise and a sunset every 45 minutes. And when you have a sunset there, it just goes from night to day very quickly. So this is one of the robotic arms. So there's the space shuttle over part of the Earth there. Again, there's the Earth rotating underneath us with part of the space station here. That's a Russian Soyuz attached to that. That's a picture I took of the sunset. And it was an oblique view. It was as we were passing into nighttime, and I was looking back as the sun was setting. So I tied this right here. There's the beautiful color. See this Terminator line right here? We're going, out of the Terminator. There's one of our Russians. I put this in here. That was one of the Russians we brought back on our first mission right here. And he didn't get a haircut for the 6 months he was there. That's what he said. I'm not going to cut my hair. Yet, he said. Yet. So here's the robotic arm again. And there's the space shuttle. This was us after undocked. So who took this video? This picture was taken by the crew of the space station of us as we were flying away, of course. That's Mount Etna in Italy. And here's the space station as it looked as I was doing the fly around. It does not look like that now. Now it is probably 4 or 5 times as large. It has enough capacity as 2 Boeing 747s. It is a very large structure now. It is a beautiful structure. And as you can imagine, look at that sun. That's a moon set in our Earth's atmosphere. Right? You can see the moon right there. Isn't that beautiful? So I wondered when we built the space station, I thought, how is this thing going to work when we build the pieces and we don't really test them on the ground? Will they work in space? I was concerned that we'd want to plug in 2 electrical parts and I'd have 2 ends that are the same, right? I wasn't really sure how that was going to happen. But it was amazing how we got into space. Everything fit extremely well, and it's a beautiful structure. I mean, it's a testament to all of the nations that supported it. And there's 17 nations that are part of this International Space Station, but America took the lead, of which I was very proud of that. All right. Okay, so as I said, we were delayed on both flights by 2 days due to weather over in Florida. And on the first one, I landed in California because we didn't have enough, our fuel cells were running low on liquid oxygen and hydrogen to provide us electrical power. Therefore, we landed in California. We were also running low on food, except for me. Yeah, when they did the meal plans, they would sit there and say, all right, this is probably all you need, a little chicken and rice, and that's all you need for dinner. And I was thinking, no, I don't think so. I need some more. So I got more calories brought in and put in my food locker than anybody else. And so when we started overstaying our time on orbit and the food pantry started running low, they all came to me. But I was glad to share because, for example, like I said, Philippe Perrin gave me his French coffee, right? So, okay, so this is going to be fun in space. You all will like this part. This is neat. This is us. We just got told, wave off. you're not coming back today. Come out of your launch and entry suits and, you know, stand by for further work. So we came out, and now it's time for us to sit there and say, hey, what are some experiments that we can do in space and things of that nature. So here's what you're going to see for the young ones right here. The most, I think the interesting thing that you're going to see mostly are how liquids operate in space, right? So liquids, of course, here, gravity will pull them down, they'll hit a surface and spread out. But in space, they come together and their surface tension keeps them as a liquid. And so there's a lot you can do with that. And that has a lot of applicability in all of the science that we're learning to do, you know, not only for medicine, as they try and look for crystals for protein growth and things of this nature, but just the whole dynamics of how we're going to live in space. And when we go to Mars someday, and we will go to Mars, which is a 3-year venture, you know, how are we going to take care of ourselves? How are we going to generate the oxygen and the water that we're going to need to go to Mars someday? All right, you ready? Oh, and look at the puffy faces here. You're going to see Peggy Whitson as she eats a few pistachio nuts. But look at her face. She's going to be puffy around her eyes, and that's how we all look in space. If you were to see pictures of me, you know, I have what looks like a cold, and in a sense I do, because all of the fluids that are in your lower extremities, the blood and everything, is not pulled down by gravity. So it starts to float back up, and then you get higher amounts of water up in your face. And so you almost feel as if you have a cold in space. And what do you think your brain does when it says, oh, you have too much fluid in your body? What does it tell you to do? You want to waste it. It says it's time to avoid it and go get rid of it. Well, that's okay so long as I stay in space. But then guess what happens when I come back to Earth's gravity and I'm now under 1 and 2 G's, and all of a sudden I'm dehydrated, severely dehydrated, and I stand up for the first time, and now gravity pulls all those fluids out. Well, all of a sudden, we started having astronauts that were passing out when they came back. So, anyway, let's enjoy fun in space, and then we'll talk about the landing. Okay, I do this for the kids because you get a little bit of music there. I always try and tell the kids that there is no up and down in space. Now, let me talk to you about Franklin Chang Diaz in a little bit too. Ask me about him. So we have music instruments. This is just a pair of pliers in space. Right, see how they twist? And it depended upon how wide open you twisted them was how quickly they would rotate and then flip over each other. Okay, here's Peggy. These are the pistachio nuts. See, now look at Peggy's eyes. Now notice too, see John, I'm the rookie. See me move around really fast? And I'm Peggy, I'm the veteran. I'm nice and slow, right? So here she is playing with a little bit of orange juice. Isn't that neat? Do you like that? That's cool, isn't it? So here's John playing. Okay, here I am. I blow too hard. I break it up into little pieces, and they capture it. And the reason why is they don't want orange juice to go behind the computers, right? So this is a drop of water, and we put a necklace into the water there. Isn't that beautiful? Okay, so after we had that day where we got a little time to do things, it was time to come home. And a lot of folks ask me, well, what was the biggest unexpected part of flying in space? Well, it was the return home, actually. Because I can practice and simulate going up in space, because we can get into a centrifuge and mimic the number of G's that you pull on ascent, but you cannot simulate going from microgravity really back down into the Earth's gravity. And what takes place is a 45-minute re-entry and landing becomes an event where you feel as if you're in a dream at first, because it's almost ballet-like. It's a beautiful event. And as you slow down from those speeds, 18,000 miles an hour, as you slow down to get ready for landing, that's when things happen the most inside the cockpit. So it's almost as if the whole sequence lulls you into being very quiet and enjoying, let's look out the window, it's a Sunday drive, And let me look out the window. Oh my gosh, we just left Australia and there's Hawaii. Whoa, how did that happen? And let me look back down. Now I have to throw a few switches. I look back up. Oh my gosh, there's California. You're kidding. I'm already over California. And then I head back down and I look up and I go, there's Edwards Air Force Base. And then the next, you know, the commander says, all right, your aircraft, fly. And so I go, whoa, I now have to fly this thing as we come into Edwards Air Force Base. So it is a very unique experience, and it's now the reason why the Space Shuttle is a beautiful vehicle, but for one reason why we're not going to do it in the future. Because now the Space Shuttle gets to do the thing for what it's known best, which is to use these wings and the vertical tail, which, of course, other types of spacecraft don't have, right? Because as I said, we are on orbit, an orbiting vehicle, but now we have to turn into a re-entry vehicle. And the way we do that is if I'm going in orbit around the Earth this way, I turn myself so that my orbital maneuvering system engines face into the direction I go. And do you remember when we got into orbit, I added 200 feet per second, right? Well, what do you think I'm going to do? I'm going to subtract out 200 feet per second of speed. I do that, and now Earth says, well, I'm going to bring you back home. So I do that burn for about 2 minutes, slow down just a little bit. I then flip the space shuttle around so that it's facing the direction that we're going. And I start out by bringing myself in at a very high angle of attack. So if my direction is this way, the space shuttle is canted this way. And as I get further down, the space shuttle and the direction that we're going becomes more like this. Then the space shuttle becomes eventually an airplane that comes into land. But during that time frame that happens, that 40 minutes where I start the deorbit burn over Australia and I land in Florida, the space shuttle has to slow down from 18,000 miles an hour to a speed that's like a normal airliner, 300 miles an hour. How do I get rid of all that speed? Well, it's these big surfaces underneath here, and because of the fact that I'm going so fast through the Earth's atmosphere, and this big surface is a big piece of material that cuts through the air, the temperatures on the outside of the space shuttle from the friction climb rapidly to around 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. So it almost becomes a blast furnace outside. And you can see that because as you look out the windows at the top and in the windows there, especially at nighttime, there's a plasma that forms. A plasma of ions that are generated by you pushing through the air so fast that you're splitting off electrons from the atmospheric atoms, and a plasma forms, and it's orange because of the temperatures, and this plasma forms on the tail, and so you can see little fireballs coming off, and it's very unique and interesting to look at, and you know you're protected by the black part of the space shuttle, which looks here like a solid surface, but isn't. Would you get that for me, Jacob? Appreciate it, which is going to pull it out. But which is really a whole series of hundreds of little tiles of a very special substance, kind of a carbon silicate that protects the space shuttle. Thank you. Was this heavy? It was very light, wasn't it? I could take a quarter and break this right through here, but in its intact form, this piece of shuttle tile protects the crew inside because it can dissipate the heat that comes in and, you know, shed it off at a very high rate. So if I wanted to, I could heat this up with a blowtorch, get it internally at a high temperature where it would glow, and I could still pick it up. And that's what protects the crew coming in. And it's very fragile though. It's why we were always so concerned. Jacob, would you put that back there? Thank you very much. So it's almost a dance, a ballet, for us to come back in because, as I said, we're using drag. So how do I know where I'm going to land if I start my deorbit burn over Australia? Well, the computers know that if I'm at this altitude, as I come down, the computer says, if you're at this altitude, you need to be 8,000 miles away from my landing. And if I'm more than 8,000 miles and I'm at this altitude, then I'm too low. And the space shuttle pulls its nose up and kind of holds it. If I'm closer, it says, oh, you're too high for where you should be. It rolls over on its wing, and we slice through the air, such as this. And of course, if we do that, then the space shuttle pulls off course, And after a few minutes, it says, okay, I've done enough of this type of maneuver. It rolls out and it says, now you're at the right altitude for the distance, but now you're off course. So it rolls back this way until you're on course. And all of this the computer does. And so you're sitting in this beautiful vehicle, and all of a sudden it does this big wing up. And that's when I knew I was really going fast, because I flew such that both of my landings were during the day. So I didn't get to see the big orange plasma shield as many as the others that somehow you just returned at night. It wasn't as if they said, oh, you have to come in during the day. It just was such that when we came in, it was day. But what it did mean is that I could see the clouds below me, right? So the first time we did this, wow, the clouds are way down there. They don't look like they're moving too fast. Then we roll up this way. Then we went this way. Then we did it one more time. And now we're much lower in altitude. Those clouds are a lot closer. And I'm doing Mach 14. And those clouds are just screaming by. And so I knew, wow, we're really moving fast. And we rolled out. That's when, all of a sudden they said, you're over Hawaii. And then about 2 minutes later, it felt like, oh, there's California. And then a couple of minutes later after that, oh, there's Edwards Air Force Base. You better get ready to land. So it happens fast. So let's look at that. And what I want you to hear is the cadence, again, as we come into land, between me and the commander. Because I have flown the space shuttle up to a certain point, but he's going to land. And he's got this helmet on. He doesn't feel very well, right? Because now we're under 1G. He's dehydrated, and so they tell us to fluid load. We have to drink a lot of water and take salt tablets, or we have to drink something like chicken consomme, which I chose not to do. Suffice it to say, lots of water, lots of salt. You're coming through the Earth's atmosphere. It gets hot. Your pressure is on, meaning, everybody's watching you. All of the astronauts that have lived in the space station that are coming back, they don't have anything to do. They're for the ride. They're like, hey, this is great. They're having fun. But the commander and the pilot, everybody's watching to make sure that you land. And so the pressure's on. It's like the Super Bowl event for you, right? You want to make sure you do things right. And the space shuttle, of course, only gets one chance to land. And so you have to be on energy, on trajectory, and we don't put the gear down until 300 feet above the ground. And the reason for that is, if you put the gear out too early, there's too much drag, and the space shuttle will land short. So everything is almost a little cadence as we come down. And I'd like for you to listen to me talk to the commander. All right, let's do our landing. So this is me getting into my launch and entry suit. Notice it's not white. So I have to have help. It's hard to put a suit on in space, actually. So there I am in the flight deck. There's the computers, the commander. There's the 3 astronauts below. And remember, they've been in space 6 months, so they're not very strong. So we have them sleeping. Now look at this right here. There's the beautiful space shuttle coming in. We're probably at about 80,000 feet right here. See the wings? And these are views from the cameras on the ground. There's the vertical tail. We've already slowed now, of course, through Mach 17, 16, 15, and on down now. There's the runway. You're looking out my heads-up display. We're at 11,000 feet, 300 knots. Watch the speed brakes right here close in and out, because they're trying to keep that 300 knots exactly. And here's the black areas as we're coming down. Here we are aiming at the ground short of the runway by 20 degrees. So we're pointing 20 degrees nose to the ground. I come up to 2,000 feet, and I tell the commander, start pulling your nose up. 1,000 feet, 300 knots, 700 feet, 600 feet, 290, 400 feet, 380, 370, 360, 300 knots, gears down. Okay, so now the gear's down. Now you can't hear, so I'll tell you what I'm saying. 20 feet, hold it off. Looking good. This will be a late chute deploy. 3 feet, hold it off. Touchdown, perfect. 185, we're doing 185 miles an hour. Lower the nose down. As soon as we get the nose down, drag chute comes out. We're at midfield. And there's the view out the window right there. gear are very delicate. They're not big ones. We can't bring landing gear like you do on a airliner. We don't have the room or the weight. So they're very spindly landing gear. And that's why they're all very careful when we land. Okay, we get ready to drag chute. We start to brake. And that tells you have a successful mission. Houston, wheels stop, which means we're back. We landed successfully. We've done our mission. And we're all very happy, of course, right? So, as I like to say, the astronauts are kind of like at the focus of what goes on, but as is always the case, as this gentleman's son that works at Johnson Space Center and is working on a project for the future, there were 10,000 people that made this work each mission, scattered around the world, right? And not only that, it's really everybody's aunt and uncle and friend in the United States that had a part in this. And my hat's off to our engineers in America in the 1970s who designed the space shuttle. It was a magnificent flying vehicle. It flew in a very difficult regime. It did cutting edge flying, right? It did the type of flying that you would not have thought that we would have tried to do with the wings back then. And it proved itself very robust, even in the face of adversity, as we saw with the Columbia spacecraft in 2003. So it's just a beautiful space shuttle, and I like to think the best of them all is Endeavour. So if you want to see its Endeavour, it's in California, right there, right? At the Space Center there. And there's 3 shuttles that are left that are flown: Endeavour, Atlantis, and Discovery. And Atlantis is in Florida at Kennedy Space Center. Endeavour is in California, and Discovery is in the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. at the Udvar-Hazy Center. And Endeavour is in the vertical as if it lifts off. Atlantis is as if it's in orbit with the payload bay open. And Discovery is in the Udvar-Hazy as if it's landed and it's rolling out, so it's on its wheels there. So it's a beautiful testament to America's space program back then. So, yes, sir.
If the auto land feature was to fail, how would you trade the simulator?
So if the auto land simulator, so this vehicle had the capability to do auto land, except that we never chose to do that because the auto land system always had a little bit of trouble with weather, or especially gusty winds. And so it was deemed very early that the commanders and the pilots would come in at Mach 1 and fly the space shuttle around in that big circle. And the reason why is you want to get your hands on the stick and feel how the space shuttle flies before you have to land this vehicle with no engines, and you need to touch down at the speeds that they're requested. So the answer is, did we ever practice auto land of the space shuttle? The answer is no. But the space shuttle computers flew the space shuttle in all the way from Mach 25 down to Mach 1. And guess how big those computers were? There were 5 of them. Each one had 256K of memory. There's more. What do you think of that, right? 5 of them, but they were so precise, none of them had any errors in the code there. We knew that there was no errors in the code, and they worked magnificently. We had to take care of them, but they worked magnificently. Yes, sir?
2 questions. At what altitude do you experience weightlessness, and why was 4.3 pounds chosen for each side?
So the question is, at what speed, altitude do you experience weightlessness?
Yes.
So weightlessness is more a factor of how fast you're going, rather than at what altitude. So if you're on a roller coaster, when you go over the top of that roller coaster and you go down the other side and you lift in your seats in that roller coaster, you were basically weightless, because what you were doing, you were falling towards the center of the earth in a free fall. If I was 1,000 feet above the earth, and if I could go fast enough to counteract Earth's gravity, then I would be weightless. The reason why we can't do that is the speeds would be so high that our our spacecraft or airplane wouldn't survive the speeds that we would have to do to travel to be able to be weightless at an altitude of 1,000 feet above the Earth's surface. At low Earth orbit, 250 miles, 18,000 miles an hour is that speed. And it would have to be faster the closer we get to the center of the Earth. So it's more of a function of speed than it is altitude. The next question I think you asked, sir, was the 4.3 pounds per square inch in the spacesuit. Well, just think, if it was more than 4.3 pounds per square inch in the spacesuit, in space where there is no pressure, right, there's no air, so the spacesuit would have been pressurized at 14.7. You could have never closed your fingers, right? It would have been just like, it would have been rigid, and you would have never been able to do any work. You need a little bit of pressure in order to breathe properly, right, on your lungs. So that number, that 4.3, is the minimum necessary to have proper breathing, but at the same time not over-pressurize the suit so that you can work and use your fingers properly. Yes, sir?
What was the normal maximum G's on liftoff?
So the question is, what are the normal G's on liftoff? Those are only 3, and we never experienced that until almost in orbit. And that's not a lot of G's, except that we maintained 3 G's for the last 2 minutes of flight. Now, for those of you who have flown a lot, been around aircraft and so forth, you realize that in high-performance aircraft, you can pull up to 6, 7, 8, 9 G's. So that's not a lot. The reason why the space shuttle could not pull many G's is that when it sat on the stack right through here, if I could get this back in there, that'd be good, but I'll leave that a minute. When it sits on this orange tank, there's only 3 braces that hold it at each position. 3 small braces. Well, I wouldn't call them small, but they're not really rigid. And so the space shuttle could not take a lot of so how do I want to say this, unequal pressure such that the orbiter would be experiencing more than 3 G's at those braces, because you could have broken the orbiter off of the stack there. So they kept it at 3. In fact, as you burn the fuel down in the external tank, you will go fast enough that you will exceed 3 G's. So approaching main engine cutoff, the engines actually start to throttle back about a minute before hitting main engine cutoff, because you're starting to exceed 3 G's. And that's one of the things the pilot looks for. And if I don't see it, my job is then to take the throttles, go to manual throttles, start to pull them back, such as that. Yes, sir?
How much speed is lost the space shuttle as it revolves around Earth?
So the question is, how much speed is lost in the space shuttle as it revolves around the Earth? So I don't think in the course of the 2 weeks that we lost much in altitude. So we really didn't have much friction with any air molecules there to lose any speed. A better question I think to ask is, how often did we have to reboost the space station, because it, with its big surfaces and the big solar panels, they actually have a little bit of friction with what few air molecules are there, and it slows down a little bit. And if you know orbital mechanics, what happens when you slow down, you actually drop in altitude. And so it'll get to a point, and this is how satellites and things re-enter the Earth's atmosphere all the time. You know, a little bit of friction with the air, you slow down, you get into a lower Earth's atmosphere, there's more air, you slow down some more, and it becomes a progression where all of a sudden Earth's gravity just pulls you in. So about every 4 to 5 months, probably, I take that back, probably every 3 to 4 months, we have to reboost the space station up a few miles, maybe 4 or 5 miles. And we did that when we docked the space shuttle. We would attach the space shuttle onto it, and we would burn not the OMS engines, but the very gentle vernier, all of the other little reaction control systems, jets that are on the space shuttle that change our attitude. We would burn those just to lift the space station about 4 to 5 miles so it would stay there.
Can the space station move itself?
No.
But there's no jets on the space station.
There are no jets on the space station. It has to be boosted by an external source. Hi, sweetie. Yes, ma'am.
What happens to those after they fall off?
So the question is, what happens to those solid rocket boosters when they fall off? I'm sure many of you all might know this. They fall back into the Earth's atmosphere. They have big parachutes come out, and they fall into the water. And we reuse those, right? And you can see now, we have cameras from some of the last space shuttle flights. You can see the space, those solid rocket boosters, they do a tumble. And you can see the Earth's surface going past and past and past until all of a sudden they reach the right altitude and the parachutes come out. So we reuse those. Yes, sir, I think there was a question. Yes, ma'am.
What's the concern with the junk that's in space now and the natural junk that's out there and hitting the space station?
So the question is, what is our concern about the space debris that exists, right? Not only what we humans have brought up there, but also the normal space debris that is the natural space debris. So it's a big problem. There are now about 22,000 pieces of debris or space objects that are man-made that the Air Force Space Command is tracking at the Joint Space Operations Center. 20,000 of which they have to be at least 5 centimeters or more to track. So that's 20,000 pieces of things that are up there at different altitudes. Some of them are much higher than what the space station flies at, and some are at different but closer altitude. So they do a conjunctive analysis all the time at the Joint Space Operations Center, and they say, as the space shuttle flies here, are there any natural pieces that are going to come very close? And if they do, they perform with either the Soyuz that's attached or the space shuttle, they perform a maneuver to move the space station out of the way of this piece of debris. Now, for the natural debris, we're concerned about that. Little pieces of meteorites or meteors or whatever, space debris that we think will probably end up striking the space station, and we know it does. In fact, while I was there, the crew hatch window on my space station on my second flight, about midway into it, obviously took the impact of a small particle, perhaps something the size of a grain of sand, and two of the very high strength tempered glass were broken. There's 7, and 2 were broken, obviously by this, a small piece of sand or something. And the reason why is because it's moving at such high speed. Many of you probably saw the movie Gravity,
Yes.
maybe, right? So the question is that a problem? And the answer is yes, we're very concerned about that. And were pieces of space debris to come in contact with the space shuttle or the space station, it would be very damaging. The problem with, and I don't want to say problem, the reason why gravity for that one scenario was not very valid is because that showed debris catching up to the space station at the same altitude, right? The same orbital plane. And that can't happen. In other words, you can't have something traveling faster in the same orbital plane because you're violating physics. But if I was in one plane going this way in my space station and orbital debris was in a different plane that crossed my orbital plane and those two came together at the same time, then that could be very disastrous. I still like the movie though. I thought it was very intense. I thought it was an intense movie. Yes, ma'am. And now I'll come back to you, sir.
Okay. At what point is inertia at its greatest point?
At what point is what, ma'am?
Is inertia at its greatest point?
Inertia.
Oh, at what point is inertia what now?
At its greatest point.
At its greatest point.
Okay, so at what point is inertia at its greatest point? Is that right? So are you talking about the IYY or the IXX or the IZZ axis? I'm just teasing, honey, because I knew that's a very good question, actually. So I think the question is, at what point is inertia at its greatest on the space shuttle in space? Is that right? Does that sound correct? I would say that the greatest inertia we had to overcome would have been the deorbit burn, because the deorbit burn required the orbital maneuvering systems engines to burn for a significant amount of time in order to overcome that 18,000 miles an hour and slow down. Remember when we were trying to circularize the burn so that we stayed in orbit? So I was already going this way, and I just had to add a little bit Well, to do the deorbit burn, you know, I'm burning the opposite direction, and so that's probably what I would say is the greatest inertia. The movement along the orbital path, because guess what? I know how to answer that question even better. Guess what's helping me stay in orbit? There, of course, is Earth's gravity, right? And when I launched, I used the Earth's rotation to help me get into space. So I would say the deorbit burn.
Okay, thank you.
You're quite welcome. Good question. You, sir.
How close are we coming to commercial travel in space? You see Virgin Atlantic, they're doing a lot of that testing right now.
Right.
Who's going to pilot?
So the question is, where does commercial space stand in the progress of putting humans in space, and who's going to fly that? Okay, so that's perfectly into what I wanted to talk about in just a little bit, which is we stopped flying the space shuttle, right? So what comes after that? Well, NASA's planning a space launch system, which we can talk about in a minute and look at a video. But at the same time, NASA recognized that there were a lot of people that were interested in developing our commercial capability to fly into space, and they championed that, they supported that. And so now you have quite a few private companies that are being spearheaded by people with immense wealth that want to conquer their next challenge, and that is space. So let's think about those. You have Elon Musk, and I don't know if you know Elon Musk, but Elon Musk was a developer of PayPal, right? He wants to go into space. He has the SpaceX Corporation. You have Mr. Bigelow, who developed the AmeriSuites series of temporary housing. And he has developed a habitable inflatable module to put in space so that people like you and I can go up there and stay, right? Kind of like a hotel in space. Then at the same time, you have Richard Branson, who developed Virgin Galactic Airlines and Virgin Records and so forth, and he is developing the Virgin Galactic Spaceship 2 spacecraft. So where are we in terms of commercializing space? I think we're getting very close to where NASA's, and they already are, saying, we want you, commercial entities, to be our taxis and our UPS for taking up supplies up to the space station. And I think that's the right approach, right? Because NASA needs to not just focus on the low Earth orbit and the space station, but we need to start thinking beyond. But they also want these entities to start taking up our astronauts. And I think that's going to take longer because NASA requires a 1 in 3,000 probability of loss of crew or loss of mission. And to get that statistical sample to say that that is the SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket has that confidence level is going to take a while, but it could happen sooner than we think. I think it's probably still maybe about 4 years before we have companies such as SpaceX carrying American astronauts. And I think it's going to be a lot longer before they start carrying Americans in or other people into space on private for fun or for hire flights. Because space flight is really hard, folks. I mean, it's simple, the concept is simple, the math is simple, right? Does that make sense? In other words, the equations are simple. We've known these since the 1400s, but the speeds are immense, right? Think about this. The first airplane was 1903, right? If I went 50 years past 1903, I'm in 1953. Well, by that time, we had gone from the Wright brothers to propellers to jets to breaking supersonic flight to people who are flying transcontinental and transoceanic on airlines. Correct? Let's start the first rocket with humans, the early 1960s. Let's go 50 years now past that. Where are we? There's still only 3 nations that have put humans in space, right? And no one flies into space. There's no commercial people in space yet. And that's because the physics of space is still, though it's not difficult to understand, it's hard to achieve. It's hard to engineer, right? I summed it up because, it was at the Journey School last year. And I was explaining this, and the kids were asking me, well, why don't we do this, and why don't I do that, or why doesn't NASA do this? And I was explaining to them the speeds, and I had a young boy, all of a sudden, oh, I got it. And I said, what is it? And he says, I know why it's hard. And I said, why? And he says, it's just physics. And it's true. And, you know, I went back, I'll tell you, this is the truth. I went 3 weeks later, and I was speaking with Lamar Smith, U.S. Representative Lamar Smith from Texas at a breakfast, congressional breakfast in downtown D.C. And I was asked basically the same question, and I used that quote saying, a young boy from Nevada understood why spaceflight is so hard and why it's important for us to stay engaged in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, and why it's important that America stay at the forefront. And that's because we develop our skills, because he recognized spaceflight is hard, it's just physics. So, to answer your question, I still think we're years away before people really go into space for fun. I think that there's too many legal issues to overcome, there's too many other little, gee, what happens when you really get up there and you find that you don't feel well in space, that kind of thing. And then, the other part is Sir Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic, which is, I'm not going to go into orbit, but I'm going to take you up and I'm going to just come across and just basically touch space a little bit on a suborbital flight and then bring you back down to land, right? That's closer, right? That's closer, and the concept is simpler, but recall, they lost a vehicle about 2.5 months ago, right? And they're still looking at it. It may have been pilot error, but nonetheless, it just tells you that the room for error is very small. I think that's closer than putting people in orbit, because the speeds are big difference. It's 25,000 feet per second to go in orbit. You know, we're talking about 5,000 to 6,000 miles an hour to do a suborbital flight. Big difference there. Yes, ma'am?
What are some of the health
issues?
Yeah, that you experienced in your...
Significant. So what are the health issues to flying in space? So first of all, I can summarize, and there's a lot to say. We humans are remarkable. We adapt to space. We adapt to most anything extremely quickly, right? We just do so, and the faster and the more you do something, the better off you adapt. So my second space flight, surprisingly, which just happened about 3 or 4 months after my first one, I had no trouble adapting back into space. But the first time you go into space, there's balance problems, right? Because you and I rely upon our vestibular system, so our intercircular canals in our ears for our balance. And if gravity isn't there to keep that stable, well, then you're thrown off, right? So there's the balance problems, there's the extension of the spine in space, as we talked about. There's radiation problems. I went to sleep one of the first 2 nights in the node between the space station and the space shuttle, which is not as heavily, I guess, armored, or is not as thick wall as the rest of the space shuttle and the space station is. I fell asleep and my eyes were closed. I saw green flashes coming through, and those were caused by gamma particles that were going through the space station and through our module and then piercing my eyes, and then of course, you know, leaving little weight trails in there, and so I knew to move out of that. So radiation is going to be a big concern. As soon as you go into space and you don't use your legs, and you don't use your arms, and you're not exercising, you start to decalcify. So I'm sure you've heard that, right? So you start to decalcify, and that is a fact. And so you've got to exercise, so that's one. Another one that we're starting to find, which we didn't realize, is the back part of the eye, and please bear with me, I'll probably say the wrong term. So I guess it's the retina with the lens in the back. Does that make sense there? Did I say that correct? So recall I said the fluids come back up? Well, because those fluids come back up into your upper body, they're starting to get I almost had the right term there and I lost it for just a second. The inner optical or optic nerve that's back there, you get fluids, and it's detaching now the back of the eye a little bit. So they're starting to find some of the astronauts that are up there for a long time. Occasionally, you're starting to see little periods of time when their vision in certain spots is, they're starting to develop areas where they don't see very well, right? So that's a long-term problem that you're going to have.
What about increases and decreases in like blood pressure and things as you're going up and coming down? How's that on the heart?
The chance of the clotting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the clotting is probably, so the question is, what about the blood pressure going up and down? I've never seen that be too much of a problem from what little I know. I do go back once a year for a flight physical, so they do a longitudinal study. So they look at all of this over the lifetime, and so they'll start piecing that together. I've never seen where that's a problem. As I said, the other ones are what I've been hearing the most, especially that intraocular pressure as you get detachment of that part of the eye there. And you said, sir, I think, what was the term? The blood clotting of the legs. Well, they're on a pretty tight exercise regime up there. We don't have a, there's not a weight machine up there, but there is a machine where you have cords that you put on and you do squats. But I will tell you that the young lady you saw there, Peggy Whitson, who I took up on my first flight, she was a big, strong farm girl. She came from a farm in Iowa, had her PhD in biochemistry. Her family raised hogs. So, I mean, she was used to, working out. And so she was a strong girl. Then she went up on orbit, and all of her free time, she just exercised. So when I picked her up 5 months later, she was even in better shape than when I took her up. But when we brought her back after about 6 months, we still had to, bless her heart, we had to kind of carry her off because of the low blood pressure from that point. So I don't think you will find blood clotting to be a problem if people stick to the exercise protocol, right? Which is pretty important. Yes, sir?
You had mentioned having a PhD. How much actual smarts does somebody need to be in the space program and actually go to space? Do you need PhD, doctorates, things like that? Or is there room for astronauts to have a lesser degrees?
So,
Or even no degrees?
No, that's very good. So let's talk shuttle, and then you guys keep leading me to the future here. But then you keep coming up with more questions, and like I say, I'll sit and talk as long as y'all want. So, for the space shuttle, there were two types of people that flew in it: the commanders and the pilots, and then the mission specialists. And the commanders and the pilots, you could have stuck us all in a room, and you could have written down, I'll bet you he has this, and we all look the same. All you need to do is just change our name tags, right? We were all, military test pilots. We'd all flown high-performance aircraft, those kinds of things. And most of us probably had advanced degrees because we knew that if we wanted to get selected by NASA, we had to do whatever it took to get selected by NASA. In fact, when I knew we were doing an International Space Station and Russia would be involved, I said, I better start learning some Russian. And so before the internet, my wife set me up with the University of Ohio while I was living in Florida, and so I would call and speak each week to this lady, and I learned my few phrases in Russian, so then when I went for my interview at NASA, I could say, "Я говорю по-русски немного." Yeah, and then if they started saying something else, I just smiled, right? But point is, all of the pilots probably had master's degrees, and those degrees were important for us to be able to relate flight tests and airplanes and systems to the engineers that had the PhDs and say, hey, this is not doing what you think the data is saying because I think this is happening. So for the commanders and the pilots, it wasn't too important. The mission specialists were a different ilk. The mission specialists NASA chose because they brought a certain skill, and so we had folks that were veterinarians, that were oceanographers, meteorologists, geologists, all those various things, and most of those had PhDs. Now, did you need it? No, absolutely not to execute, because really, right now, we are in the Conestoga wagon phase of space flight, right? Where we're trying to move west And our biggest concern is getting this wagon to the next stop, making sure I can build a fire and protect myself. Well, that's where we are on the space station right now. There is science that's being done, but most of the effort is just learning the skill set to be able to live in space. And in fact, one of my crew members, not my crew members, but one of my members from my astronaut class in 1996, I think he lifts off sometimes this March, and he's going for the American record on orbit 1 year, right? So, so the point is you don't need the PhDs, but guess what? That PhD that person got to get there made him conversant across that topic. But what I always found in these folks that had their PhDs, that was not that only area that they could speak. NASA would not select one person that all they knew was this. They found people that had a wide range of knowledge across quite a few. They had one area that they dug deep on, but they had knowledge across quite a few. So hopefully that helps. Yes, sir.
Astronaut syndrome. What did you do? Did you experience it, or know anybody who did it? What was done to help with personal and professional motivation?
So when you say astronaut syndrome,
That would be the full experience of going out into space, or at least experiencing a huge event, such as going out into space,
right,
and then coming back and then facing life back on Earth afterwards.
Ah, good question. So I think the question you're asking is, did I or any of my peers have to adjust to life after having flown in space without that goal of getting to space there in front of us? And if so, how did we adjust to that? So that's actually a very interesting question. I thought you were asking me about space adaptation sickness, which is, it takes a while for you're asking me for the body to adapt, right? As I was saying. So I think there's various people. You had a wide spectrum of folks that adapted to, what do I do next in life after that, right? So you have some folks that never leave NASA because it is a cocoon of what you know, and there's people there that you feel comfortable with. It's a very interesting job, and people really like it, and so they stay there. Then you have some folks that say, I don't want to still be at NASA, but I want to be connected with aviation. I want to do this type right through here. Then I see folks that want to move out and they want to pick up a whole new challenge. And that would have been myself, for example. That would have been, like Sandy Magnus, who is now the director of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, and she wants to work in South America and learn Spanish and then work on being in the Peace Corps down there. So what I did not see is I did not see the people had trouble adapting to their next life, because I think these people are all people that have had a challenge, they've met it, then they find another challenge and they meet that, then they find another challenge and they meet that. So I never found anybody that had trouble adapting post being an astronaut. Hopefully that was a good answer.
Yes.
Okay, so real quick, and I think I see somebody on the side of the stage, this is a perfect time now to go into what are we going to do next, right? So what is NASA going to do after, or in conjunction with that question you asked me, sir, about the commercial space flight, right? Well, this is the next rocket that NASA's developing. So you tell me, sweetie, what do you see in this rocket that's different from the space shuttle? Does this one have wings? Does this one have a tail? No. Do you see anything that's the same though? The boosters. So NASA's building what is called the Space Launch System, which is the follow-on. And for many of us, what does this look like? Saturn V, right? Do we see a capsule up here again? So what did NASA say? All right, let's go back to simple. Let's don't have wings. Let's don't have a tail. And let's go beyond low Earth orbit. The space shuttle could never go beyond low Earth orbit. So what are we going to do? We're going to build the largest rocket that's ever been designed. It's going to have the Orion capsule up here. is going to be able to carry, if it's not carrying the astronauts, I can put a payload fairing in here and I can carry all of the supplies, all of the components that are necessary to go to the moon and to go to Mars. And I'm going to use some of the technology that we already have, which are the solid rocket boosters here, right? So NASA is in the process of converting these models into the real thing, and they just had their first test flight of the Orion space craft, where the astronauts are going to sit, last December. They didn't launch it on this rocket. This doesn't exist yet, but they put it on a different rocket. They flew it into space in this big orbit around the Earth, such that when it came back towards the Earth, it was picking up the speeds that you would see if you were flying back from the moon. Roughly, probably 25,000 miles an hour instead of 18,000 miles an hour. And the reason why is they wanted to test the Orion space, the new heat shield on the Orion spacecraft, and to see if our navigation and the parachutes were working. And the test was wildly successful. So we're well on our way of having the new spacecraft. And I tell you what, I'm very happy. The Russians have been good about carrying our astronauts up since 2012 or so up to the space station, but I want an American rocket to carry our American astronauts up, right? So we're getting to that point. So we're developing the new material. You can't see this. Just realize that it's not that very fragile, that tile that I showed you a while ago. We're using new techniques that come from textiles, and we're weaving in the ablative material that's going to protect that Orion vehicle from coming in. And so that's what NASA's doing. They're developing those techniques. And remember, everything that NASA did, in a sense, impacted everything that we use technology-wise at some point, right? The cell phones you have, everything that you use, you can trace a good part of that, I think, back to our space program in the 60s and 70s when we had to focus on what is called space, weight, and power. You can't carry a lot into space. You still got to have power for everything. So how are we going to miniaturize and still be able to communicate, have our thrusters work and all of that? And that's what NASA really focused on, and all of that eventually makes its way down. That doesn't mean we wouldn't have had cell phones eventually. I just think that we got there faster because of the miniaturization of components that NASA did. So, do you want to show that, or are we good to go? We're going to say adios?
Let's see it.
Okay, so here's the last little bit, the last video, and this one's a little technology, it's for y'all, but what I want you to think about is, here we are developing, you'll have to turn the sound up on this one, because now we've got to look at what is called EDL, Entry, Descent, and Landing, because now we have to be able to do that.
They didn't call it the 7 minutes of terror for no reason.
So what they're showing right
NASA's
here.
Space Technology Mission Director is investing in a suite of EDL technologies.
So remember we put the Mars rover on Mars about 2 years ago, right? And it took an incredible amount of technology to do that. So now we have new heat shields. There's that new fighter right here. That's what I just showed you.
Propulsion technologies, instrumentation, and new modeling capabilities. NASA is advancing the technology of inflatable and mechanically deployable heat
So
shield
these are all of the technologies, that NASA is developing now, so that we can bring the Orion and other spacecraft
Another way to
back
slow
in.
descent and land safely on Mars is to use atmospheric drag. Current parachute technology for decelerating from the high speed of atmospheric entry to the final stages of landing on Mars dates back to NASA's Viking program. NASA is expanding that technology through its low-density supersonic decelerator project. In 2014, a rocket-powered
So they're doing experiments on the space station right now,
coast
you
of
can
Hawaii
see.
and demonstrated 2 new landing technologies, a supersonic inflatable aerodynamic decelerator and a supersonic parachute.
And after the show that, you can probably turn it off, Jimmy.
Another method of landing safely on
And then,
Mars
of course,
is
there's
through
retro rockets that we're going to have to develop So,
This landing maneuver.
and this is a real video. This is SpaceX's Grasshopper rocket, and the whole idea is, can I vertically take off a rocket and bring it back down and land vertically? And they succeeded, right? And then here's the woven thermal protection system.
It's also important.
So anyway, the point is that NASA right now has been, since we retired the space shuttle, developing the technologies that are going to be used in the next vehicle. And this should fly, they think, in 2018. I don't think so. I think it'll probably be 2020 because I'm adding on those normal delays that occur with things like this. But at some point, the United States will have a rocket big enough to start to carry our astronauts back to the moon and Mars, which is where we should be as far as, you know, in my mind. So anyway, what do we think, sir? Do you want to?
Well, listen, can you feel the passion and just the enthusiasm? That he did mention before is that in space, one of the things he loves was M&Ms.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, and so he would have them flying around and catch them in his mouth. And so, Jacob, we went and we ran down this afternoon to
There you go.
different little things.
That's perfect.
Yeah, well,
excellent.
yeah, we tried our best. And then as you're leaving, we got everybody here some M&Ms as well. So on your way out, keep those up.
Nice job.
And just
Thanks,
once again,
Jake.
if we can give a round of applause to Colonel Lockhart.
I'll be glad to take pictures. I have some pictures to sign if you want. Any grandkids, nephews, nieces, whatever. So
All right,
I'm glad to do
thank you
that.
so much.
Absolutely.